Stargate, a novel by Dean Devlin and Roland Emmerich. Chapter 12. So much for communication. Thousands upon thousands of ragged, dirty men were laboring in organized large groups into battalions of 200 or more, some of them working on the narrow shelves cut into the bright white cliffs, others out on the muddy floor of this colossal mining pit. It was a scene of horrible human misery. In the stifling afternoon heat, the miners were scrambling everywhere, edging out on thin ledges cut into the chalky cliffs. At the bottom of the valley, where the groundwater prevented them from going deeper, they worked in milk-colored mud. At several points around the perimeter of the stadium-shaped bowl, there had been major cave-ins, places where the soft walls had given way and crashed toward the muddy bottom, burying everything in their way. O'Neill surveyed the scene through his binoculars. Young children no older than 7 or 8 worked alongside the men. Their main task appeared to be carrying satchels of ore or coal-like substance up the network of thin trails that snaked like veins to the top of the ravine. But the most dramatic way in or out of this man-made canyon were the rope ladders. There were hundreds of these hand-woven ladders hanging everywhere between levels. But half a mile from the team, 24 of them reached spectacular lengths, connecting the very bottom of the pit with a rock outcropping 300 feet above. Uneven in thickness and stitched with broken rungs, they looked perilously slipshod. Nonetheless, each of them wagged back and forth with the weight and motion of between 40 and 50 boys at once, some climbing with their loads, others passing them on the way down. They were dark-skinned people, some working shirtless, but most of them wearing thick robes that covered them shoulders to ankles. It seemed like bizarre wardrobe given the intense heat. Worse, their heads were covered by hoods or scarves, wrapped in a fashion similar to the Bedouins of Syria and Jordan. The mining enterprise extended into the valley for 2.5 miles. From the team's angle, the workers looked like ants moving everywhere across the surface of the valley. One work group, at least 100 men strong, was working a long stone's throw beneath the soldiers. Their work was kicking up clouds of white dust so thick it looked impossible to breathe. They were covered with the powdery soot, giving them the eerie appearance of dusty ghosts. The away team was astonished, blown away. They thought they were prepared for anything. 10-foot-tall aliens with swollen pink heads wouldn't have surprised them half as much as what they had found. Humans. It sent a shockwave of recognition through the team, a sudden awareness of being related to these people. Even O'Neill did something completely out of character. Once he'd established the workers were not armed, he handed the binoculars to Brown, who was clearly eager for a look. Daniel's mind raced. Human beings here, on the other side of the known universe? What was the connection? Could these people be descendants of people from Earth? Or more disturbingly, could we be descended from them? For every answer Daniel could find, 1,000 questions would arise. Everything changed the moment the first worker looked up and made eye contact with Daniel. His shout caused 100 heads to turn toward the top of the dune. Then, in a long chain reaction back across the busy valley, work stopped and all the thousands looked to see what was happening. Those who were close enough saw the 4 men in green clothing isolated against the giant wall of white sand. Kowalski and Ferretti instinctively readied their guns and wanted to retreat up the hill to better positions. O'Neill signaled them, guns down, and watched the curious miners watch him. There was no malice in the growing crowd, but neither was there any sign of welcome. Neither side knew how to move. "Fall back," Kowalski decided. Then he corrected himself. "Should we fall back, sir?" "What would that accomplish?" O'Neill asked after thinking it over. We might as well meet the neighbors. He started off down the slope. What the hell's he doing now? Asked Brown, knowing exactly what O'Neill was doing. Let's trail him, Kowalski said, getting up to follow. Now 20,000 eyes were fixed on the strange visitors as they piled their way down one of the spillways into the ravine. Some watched frozen from the cliffs, laying their tools on the ground. Across the uneven valley floor they continued to come, crowding around to gawk up at the first unknown travelers in their history. As Daniel walked down into the gorge, he felt like something was swallowing him. O'Neill led the way, watching the crowd gather mass. Fortunately, he saw no sign of hostility. The people seemed peaceful and curious, but there was something strange in the way they were milling about. O'Neill couldn't quite put his finger on what was odd in their behavior. He gave the crowd his iciest stare, intentionally intimidating them, but when he saw that wasn't necessary, the next step was to talk. Jackson, come down here. He motioned his Egyptologist forward. Talk to them. What? How? You're the language expert. Try and communicate. Daniel hesitated, but then plunged in. With the entire population of the mining colony scrutinizing him, he slowly walked past O'Neill to the base of the cliff. He approached one of the miners, a skinny, buck-toothed man, and spoke the historic first words between the two disparate cultures. Hello. The man turned and laughed nervously to no one in particular. He was more than a little tense about being singled out like this. I am Daniel. Daniel, he said again, gesturing broadly to himself. And you? Blank stares. Daniel tried a formal Japanese-style bow. This time he met with more success. Several of the men in front awkwardly returned the gesture. It was a start. Esalatimana, Daniel said very formally, bowing once again. The miners raised their eyebrows and looked at one another. Obviously, they didn't speak Aramaic. Switching gears, Daniel tried speaking Ancient Egyptian, a language that hadn't been heard on Earth for the past 1,700 years. Since no one knew exactly how to pronounce the verbal equivalents of the hieroglyphs, all Daniel could do was take a stab at it. Neket Senefer Adoni, he announced. We come in peace. The miners stared back at him, politely curious, but obviously not understanding him. He tried several slight variations of the sentence's vowel structure, but nothing seemed to work. Either they didn't understand Ancient Egyptian, or he couldn't speak it. He went through several less likely possibilities. He greeted the crowd in Berber, Amadic, Ancient Hebrew, and Chadic. But nothing worked. It was an intensely frustrating moment for Daniel. He had spent his life studying these languages, achieving levels of fluency that were far beyond the merely useful. Now he was given the incredible opportunity to actually use them, and found that they were good for nothing. Daniel looked up at the hot suns contemplating his next move, and began absent-mindedly fiddling with the medallion around his neck when a man standing nearby came absolutely unglued and started screaming wildly. He was screaming something to the rest of the miners, a look of sheer terror on his face. Naturu Yaya! Naturu Yaya! He cried over and over while he backed away, cringing in fear as if Daniel were going to start whipping him at any second. Everyone started dropping to their knees as quickly as they could and assumed the position, putting their faces to the sand in a posture of abject servitude and submission. In a few seconds the words Naturu Yaya had been repeated in every corner of the mining pit, causing the many thousands of miners to prostrate themselves face down in the white sand. What the hell did you say to them? O'Neill demanded. Nothing. All I said was hello. Damn it, I told you to communicate with them. How? Daniel pointed at the groveling masses. Oh, for Christ's sakes, Jackson. Just communicate. Exasperated, O'Neill studied the crowd for a moment, then approached one. a teenage boy at random. He tugged the kid to his feet with one hand and offered a handshake with the other. When the boy didn't understand, O'Neill seized his hand and shook it vigorously, saying, "Hello, United States of America, Colonel Jack O'Neill." The boy looked like he had developed rigor mortis. He was so alarmed and confused he was about to cry. When O'Neill saw this, he relaxed his grip and let the terrified youngster take off running, scared out of his wits. "So much for communication," Daniel commented dryly. "Colonel, 11 o'clock. Kowalski drew attention to something moving toward them across the floor of the valley. It was another one of the mammoth-like animals, but this one was finely groomed, with silver ornaments and carefully braided hair. On its humped back it carried a decorated howdah, whose passenger was hidden behind veils draped over the windows. As the animal ambled forward, it parted the silent crowd like a royal rowboat bobbing through water lilies. Walking beside the animal, speaking excitedly up to the closed litter, was the same boy who shook O'Neill's hand. The window cover was pulled back, and the rider shouted angrily at the boy, who immediately backed away. The animal arrived, escorted by a small entourage that included some females. The soldiers assumed they were about to meet one of the overseers of this miserable operation, and poised themselves for a showdown. But when the small door swung open, it was a thin old man who climbed down the side of the animal with surprising agility. He wore a deep red robe that was unlike those worn by the others. He had on a headdress similar to the ones worn by the Bedouins of the Middle East. His gray beard was carefully shaped. His mood was very serious, concentrated as he walked over to the group. He walked right up to Daniel. Without warning, he fell to his knees and started racing through some sort of catechism or prayer. He was talking fast, inches from Daniel's feet. Daniel looked back at his companions and asked, "What's he doing?" "We do not know, O Holy Master," Kowalski said with a smirk and a mock bow. It was obvious these people thought Daniel was something he wasn't. Daniel bent and listened to the small man as he recited the long invocation. The words sounded like they could be Amadic or Berber, possibly even Shattuck. Whatever it was, Daniel didn't recognize it. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the prayer was over. The old man pushed himself back onto his feet and was imitated by everyone in the valley. He signaled for the women to come forward. 2 of them did, bringing water in big earthen cups. The younger woman came to Daniel, handing him a piece of very soft cloth. Then she raised her pitcher to pour the water. Did she want to wet the towel? He held it out to her, cupped in his hand. She held out her finger and shook it. "No, take that away." By the time Daniel understood what he was expected to do, it was too late. He'd looked into the girl's eyes and been electrocuted by her beauty. Her impossibly magnetic eyes. His mind went into an immediate tailspin, and he started experiencing déjà vu. But how could he have a déjà vu about someone he was absolutely positive he had never seen before? Maybe it was the first sign of sunstroke. He must have looked strange because the girl reached up with the washcloth and wiped him across the brow. Daniel was surprised by the open tenderness of her gesture, the caring way she wiped the cool towel across his forehead. She held out the pitcher again, and this time Daniel, looking into her eyes, knew what to do. He cupped his hands and caught the drink she poured him, then swallowed it while giving her a meaningful look. The girl, 20 years old and painfully shy, then moved on to Kowalski. Daniel noted with disappointment that she wiped his forehead in the same way. It was just part of the ceremony. The old man was speaking to him again. He tried to concentrate, then an idea hit him. Daniel unwrapped a half-melted Fifth Avenue bar and held it out, offering the man a taste. The man understood what Daniel was doing, but was clearly apprehensive about eating the exotic brown substance. To him, as for humans everywhere, the sight of an unfamiliar food looked ugly and potentially poisonous. After some hesitation, He reached out, accepted the bar, and took a small bite. His worried eyes grew wide with concentration as he chewed. Then suddenly, his whole face lit up in a smile. Bonnie way. Bonnie way? Daniel repeated the word, thrilled to be communicating with him. Bonnie way? He said again, giving the new taste an enthusiastic endorsement. What the hell does that mean? Interrupted Kowalski. I have no idea, replied a thrilled Daniel. Pointing and beckoning, the man in the red robe used sign language to invite his visitors to go somewhere beyond the high walls of the pit. They're inviting us to go somewhere. Where? How should I know? Somewhere in that direction. The squad turned to O'Neill for a decision, but he hadn't made one yet. He was watching the old man like a hawk, scanning him for any clue of deception. He didn't want to walk into a trap. The old one seemed puzzled by the silence. He repeated the invitation with clearer, broader gestures. Daniel tried to persuade O'Neill. Aren't we looking for signs of civilization? Okay, now we've obviously hit a bullseye. If we want to find the Stargate symbols and get back home, we've got to go with them. This is my best shot. O'Neill just stood there, as expressive as a brick wall. Although it was a pretty convincing argument, he knew Daniel was more excited about playing the role of amateur archaeologist than anything else. He wasn't convinced until Brown added additional new evidence. He's probably right, sir. I've been taking some readings on this stuff they're mining. It's the same quartz-like material that the Stargate is made of. All right, there's no alternative, O'Neill concluded. Radio back to base camp. Tell them to keep the area secure until we return. They came out of the pit along a wide switchback trail, the old man leading a caravan 10,000 strong. At the top of the road, there were two more tall obelisks marking the entrance. Daniel broke out of the line and jogged up to walk beside the old man, to study his manner and dress. His name was Kasuf, and although ceremony called for him to walk alone, he wanted to know more about these visitors, so he allowed Daniel to walk alongside him. He wasn't sure whether they were gods, but with production slowing in the quartz mines lately, he didn't want to take any risks. He could see that their weapons were very advanced, and their manner was not entirely friendly. They were dangerous in more than one way. Whether they were gods or not, Kasuf didn't want to take any chances, so he decided it best to treat them as though they were. The one walking next to him, the one with glasses who sneezed so often, seemed friendly and peace-loving enough, and very talkative. Kasuf listened patiently to the young man's gibberish, but could make no sense of it. Daniel had never had so much trouble communicating in all his life. He felt himself on the verge of losing his temper, so he took a deep breath and marched along with the old man for several minutes in silence. About the only thing he learned before rejoining the soldiers was that these giant pack animals were called mastages. Each of the stump-headed animals was tended to by a distinctive-looking teenager. Cleaner and younger than the miners, the shepherd boys wore striking haircuts, long dreadlocks dangling from mostly clean-shaven scalps. Marching next to Kasuf was the boy who seemed to be the de facto leader of the shepherds, the same boy who had unwillingly shaken hands with O'Neill a few minutes before. His name was Skara. He was a handsome, skinny kid who walked with his shoulders back and his chin in the air. He was angry with himself for having run away from O'Neill before, and was determined to be fearless from now on. The caravan snaked out into the desert. It was a full mile later before the whitish quartz dust surrounding the mining pit gave way to the planet's natural topsoil, the same brown silica the soldiers found around the pyramid. How many centuries of chiseling pieces of quartz out of the pit's giant walls, then hauling them up the ladders a bag at a time, had it taken to create these eerie white dunes? Daniel kept trying. Back in line, he pestered the miners on all sides of him, asking question after incomprehensible question. He wanted to learn the names of things. hoping he might stumble across some linguistic clue that could teach him to speak their language. He was practically bouncing down the trail, intensely interested in everything around him. But there were two things distracting him. His hotophobia was acting up, making him sneeze every other minute, and, of course, the girl. She was only a few strides behind him, and Daniel kept inventing reasons to turn around. Each time their eyes met, both looked nervously away. He was in the middle of asking the confused miner next to him about their agriculture when he felt someone touch him in a rather private place. Goosed, he spun around to find the same disgusting monster that had dragged him across the desert. Now the beast was trying to nuzzle up to him affectionately. "Get away!" Daniel swatted at the animal. The animal cried out, bleating like a 10-ton goat. Everyone close enough to witness the scene thought it was pretty funny. They were cracking up, but no one laughed harder than a strange-looking shepherd boy. He was shorter than the others, and his skull was oddly shaped. Above his Cro-Magnon eyebrows, his head swelled like something were trying to get out of the top. His big, horsey teeth were so crooked they looked like white tomahawks tossed at a red target. His name was Nabe. "Mastej!" The boy grinned widely. Both the animal at the front of the caravan, next to Kasuf, and this one trying to cuddle with Daniel, were called Mastej. However, there was a vast difference between the stately beast parading up ahead and the slobbering, malodorous monstrosity molesting Daniel. The caravan turned and headed down a long valley with a steep line of rocky cliffs on the right. 20 minutes later, they'd come to a break in the cliffs. Daniel looked behind him and saw the thousands of people marching in line, still coming over the last crest and down into the valley. Kasuf turned them up the slope toward the gap in the hills when he came to the top. He stopped and called Daniel to the front, pointing across a long plain. In the distance, Daniel saw the high walls of a huge fortress, a city. It was the ancient settlement of these people, rising like an island from the endless ocean of sand. Awed, Daniel turned and shouted to the soldiers, "It's a city!" While O'Neill trotted forward to recon the scene, Daniel had time to pick the maiden out of the crowd again. They looked directly at each other for a heartbeat until both pretended to notice something else. This exchange did not go unnoticed by Kasuf. "Put your tongue back in your mouth," O'Neill snapped, arriving at the top of the hill. He surveyed the scene, then came down the slope to find his men. He explained that they would enter the enclosed city one at a time, at intervals of 10 paces. Brown, then Kowalski, then Jackson, then himself. Kowalski knew that was the order in which O'Neill would choose to sacrifice his men if it turned out to be an ambush. When O'Neill left to explain the sequence to Daniel, Kowalski turned to Brown. "As soon as you're inside, check above and behind. I'll be 2 paces behind you." When they came within 200 yards of the city, the old one, Kasuf, signaled for something. One of the women brought forward a long animal horn. The old man put it to his lips and trumpeted a message to the city. A set of tall doors swung open between the 2 main towers. These towers, 80 feet tall, were made of the same material as the rest of the city, solid stone the color of straw. The perimeter wall, which ran off unevenly in both directions for several hundred yards, was only slightly lower than the towers, about the height of a 6-story building. Kasuf had sent a few of the boys running ahead before O'Neill could stop them, so by the time Brown was at the gate, a throng of curious onlookers were swarming the entrance. Before he was through the doors, Brown knew there was no possibility of avoiding an ambush, if that is what these people had planned. Inside the city there were more tall buildings crowding around narrow streets. The air itself was thick with people, a matrix of footbridges connecting the upper floors of the buildings. All of them were jammed with spectators who could be concealing weapons beneath their long robes. For the last few minutes, Daniel had been suffering another sneezing attack, drawing strange looks from his fellow marchers, and now from the people observing from the slate-gray rooftops. Adding to his discomfort, his filthy friend, the mastage, had been bumping him with its oily nose looking for more candy. As he came to the doors, wide enough for 10 people to walk abreast, the distance between him and the girl closed. Now they were walking practically side by side, and Daniel felt a rush of heat come to his face. He ransacked his mind for something suitable to say to her, and was about to speak when the mastage nuzzled him again in a sensitive area. Daniel quickly pulled the last Fifth Avenue bar out of his pocket. Before he unwrapped it, he shook it in the animal's face. "A little bit," he explained to the animal before he unwrapped the treat. But the big, fleshy lips reached out and snatched the bar away. "A little bit, I said." But the animal was already chewing happily. "Now stop bugging me." Behind him, Daniel heard O'Neill's voice say, "I told you not to feed it." The miners walking nearby picked up on the words, "little bit," repeating them over and over. The foul-smelling mastage had a new name. Daniel's torment ended when one of the boys pulled the animal away by the reins toward a holding area just inside the gate. The animal moaned in protest about being separated from its new provider. When Daniel looked up, he was both amazed and very uneasy. This was not a city for a claustrophobe. The rough walls towered above them as they walked along this central street. On both sides, narrow twisting alleyways cut between the buildings. At every angle, from windows and bridges, pressed into doorways and leaning over ledges, the population of this city surged forward to stare at him with intense curiosity. The team was now completely at the mercy of this people, about whom they knew almost nothing. When they were 100 yards deep into the citadel, they came into a large open square, where Kasuf had turned to wait for them. While people filled the square, Daniel studied the buildings around them. The primary building material was stone, large slabs skillfully quarried, but the most surprising element was wood. The rickety staircases that staggered up the sides of buildings, the gangplanks bridging the upper floors, and the doors to the many apartments were all made of a gnarled rose-colored wood. Around the windows and across the cornices of the buildings, elaborate geometrical designs had been chiseled into the stone, but nowhere could Daniel spot anything that looked like a written inscription. Kasuf stepped onto a small platform and raised his staff into the air, signaling for the crowd to be silent. When they were, he turned to the visitors and started rambling through what sounded like another prayer. When he was finished, he used his long staff to point to a covered object hanging high between two buildings. As he did so, a man on a scaffolding pulled away a large piece of cloth. As the curtain fluttered to the ground, Daniel looked up in total astonishment. Suspended under the archway by a tangle of bulky ropes, he saw an enormous gold disc, easily 10 feet across. Emblazoned across its surface was an exact replica of the design on Daniel's medallion, the one Catherine found in Egypt. As soon as the giant disc was revealed, the entire assembly fell to its knees in one massive human wave, bowing toward the visitors. It was an awesome sight. "I think they think we're gods," Daniel stammered. "What do you think could have given them that idea?" He looked up at the giant disc, then down at the smaller version hanging on Daniel's chest. He reached out and took hold of the antique treasure, pulling Daniel half a step closer. The colonel looked at him, suspicious, menacing. "Exactly what does this symbol mean?" he asked threateningly. He was sure Daniel knew a lot more than he was letting on. "It's the sign of Ra, the Egyptian sun god." As Daniel explained this, he felt a sour, sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach. "It looks like they worship him. They must think he sent us here." Satisfied Daniel was telling the truth, O'Neill released his grip on the medallion. From his platform, Kasuf was making some sort of speech, gesturing frequently toward the team. Somewhere in the middle of it, Brown's radio squelched to life. The signal was so dim, Brown plugged in an earphone and cranked the volume up. Through the crackling of electrostatic interference, he heard what sounded like Ferretti's voice. It had come on so quickly, there was almost no warning. At first, Ferretti had ordered the team off the crest of the bluff toward shelter. He quickly realized his mistake, struggled up the hill, and got on the shortwave radio. Down on his knees with his jacket pulled over his head, he was screaming as loud as possible into the handset. He was trying to warn the away team. The roaring noise around him, a high-pitched, shrieking howl, made it difficult for him to hear his own voice. "Must abandon base camp! Repeat, must abandon base camp!" he yelled. As he knelt, he felt something crash down on top of him. It was Porro, staggering blindly across the top of the bluff. "Let's go!" he yelled to Ferretti. "Let's get the hell out of here!" Ferretti nodded. They had to get back to the pyramid, or they were dead men. "Come again, base camp. We do not copy," Brown said urgently into the handset. "Say again, base camp." By that time, everyone's attention was riveted to the drama of Brown shouting into his radio. Whatever ceremony the old man was trying to observe had been completely interrupted. Frustrated, Brown gave up trying. He looked to O'Neill and said, "It's no use. Something's interfering with the signal." A deep horn blast sounded from the top of the perimeter wall near the main gate. A moment later, a second horn moaned to life, and the pair of them sent a low, rumbling blast through the city. Every head in the square turned and looked as one. Something was wrong. O'Neill made a snap decision. "We're heading back right now. Let's move." Kowalski and Brown were on their feet and moving before Daniel could say why. O'Neill's first impulse was to leave Daniel behind, maroon him, pay him back in kind, but at the last minute he came back and grabbed Daniel by the sleeve of his uniform and started pulling him down the narrow street. The path back to the gate was choked with at least 1,000 people. As the soldiers pushed forward, hands reached out to stop them, and mouths frantically speaking tried to explain something urgent. They were telling the soldiers not to go. At first, O'Neill pushed them aside politely but firmly, but when he saw a handful of men pushing the main gates closed, he broke into a dead sprint, clearing the way with a series of brutal forearm shoves to the head or throat of anyone who stood in his way. The men closing the gate ignored O'Neill's howling. They had just finished reinforcing the door with the first of 3 heavy crossbeams when O'Neill arrived at the entrance, flanked by his 2 soldiers. "Open the door!" he thundered at them, showing them what he wanted with a gesture. All of them started talking at once, waving their hands and pointing over the wall, out into the desert. It was clear they weren't going to cooperate, so O'Neill called Kowalski over. "You think we can lift that beam by ourselves?" Kowalski shot him a look that said, "Easily." Standing shoulder to shoulder, they were a formidable sight, both of them taller and more muscular than these mostly thin, mostly haggard people. No one in their right minds would tangle with these two. Nevertheless, as they moved toward the gate, one of the gatekeepers reached out and grabbed O'Neill's wrist. With a speed that surprised even his men, the colonel corkscrewed the man's arm behind his back and slammed him face first against the door. As the man slid, half-conscious and whimpered, to the ground, O'Neill took his pistol from its holster and pointed it into the crowd. "Don't do it!" Daniel screamed. O'Neill raised the gun above his head and fired 3 times into the air. Each explosion jolted the crowd. They had never heard gunfire before, and they were instinctively terrified. Everyone froze in their tracks, stunned and afraid. Kasuf, trailed by 2 of the city's elders, caught up to the team and nervously came forward out of the crowd to see what was happening. "Shashe-tiu!" the old man yelled. "Brown, help Kowalski open this door." O'Neill was going eye to eye with the crowd. daring the next person to make a move. Daniel was sure O'Neill would start mowing people down any second. He had no idea why the colonel had gone berserk, ruining all the goodwill they had established with these strange desert people. Leaving before they had explored the city, he thought, would be a suicidal mistake. They still needed the signs for the Stargate. "Sachet to you! Sachet to you!" Scar, the shepherd boy, who had unwillingly shaken O'Neill's hand at the mining pit, came out of the crowd, moving very slowly. O'Neill lifted his pistol, aiming for the space between the boy's eyes. "Sachet to you," he kept saying softly. He held his hands open and in front of him as he approached the man in the black beret, careful neither to threaten nor show fear. Accustomed to handling the powerful messages, Scara knew how to approach a frightened animal. O'Neill cocked the firing pin, but the boy kept coming closer, repeating the words and pointing to the ramparts at the top of the wall. O'Neill glanced up to the walkway at the top of the thick walls. A dozen or so people were spectating from up there, and some of them waved for him to come up. The boy pointed to the colonel, then up at the wall, and used his fingers like eyes looking around. "He wants you to look over the wall," Daniel interpreted for O'Neill. "I know what he wants." O'Neill turned to Kowalski before following the boy up the ladder. "If they try anything, drop 'em." With one last check around, O'Neill followed Scara into one of the towers that stood at either side of the gate. Inside, they wound their way up a circular staircase built for people shorter than the American soldier. They came out onto the stone walkway between the city's double wall, standing where his team could see him. O'Neill looked out over the wall for what seemed like a long time. "What is it, Colonel?" Kowalski didn't appreciate being left hanging when he was holding 1,000 people at gunpoint. A giant, low-flying brown cloud as wide as the horizon was rolling across the desert floor toward the city like a flash flood. O'Neill could feel the breeze turning to wind at the top of the parapet. "A sandstorm! Coming this way!" he yelled back. Scara pointed beyond the wall and taught O'Neill the word for sandstorm. "Sachet to you." "Excellent," Daniel said sarcastically. "That would have been an excellent reason to shoot everyone." Not content to let tempers cool by themselves and suddenly sure he had the moral high ground, Daniel marched over to the soldiers and forced the nose of Kowalski's rifle toward the hard-packed ground. "Don't push me, Jackson," the lieutenant warned him. O'Neill leaned over the parapet and called down, "We'll have to stay here until the storm is over." Freddie realized it was probably too late, but he had to try. Lugging the 30-pound stationary radio unit, he fought his way through the storm, staggering up the long ramp toward the shelter of the pyramid. The gusts, sweeping up ton after ton of sand, were strong enough to knock him off the ramp and out into the dunes if he lost his balance. As the dust thickened, he pulled his t-shirt up over his nose to filter the air. Squinting hard to protect his eyes, he moved more and more slowly, afraid of stepping off the side of the ramp. He came through the tall open entrance and turned the corner, wiping the fine sand away from his face. As soon as his scratched and watery eyes were clear enough to see, he switched the radio on. "Mayday! Mayday! Brown, do you read me?" As the last members of Ferretti's base squad came stumbling in out of the storm, he was already edging his way back toward the dust storm, trying to get his radio signal around the stone walls. After a minute of trying, he thought he heard Brown's voice responding, through the crackle of interference, but he couldn't be sure. The storm was too loud. Just in case Brown could hear him, Ferretti screamed into the transmitter, trying to alert them to the disaster headed their way. After several minutes, he retreated deeper into the cavernous shelter, positioning the radio set as close to the door as possible. He turned the volume up full blast and set his helmet over the top of it to help protect against the dust. With sand crunching between his teeth, Ferretti moved back inside to join the rest of the team. They had no idea whether the away squad was safely under the protection of the thousands of people Brown had told them about over the radio, or whether they were choking to death somewhere out in the desert. But all of them could sense their chances of surviving this mission quickly slipping away. Without anyone saying a word, they sat down in a semicircle facing the entrance and watched the dark wind whip sand past the doorway. After a minute, Freeman got up and went to the radio, switching it off and pulling it several feet further from the dust. "You're wasting the batteries," he said to Ferretti. "We're not going to get any kind of signal during this storm. We should try again when this thing passes." "This is bad, man. This is very, very bad." Ferretti shook his head. "I was in Saudi Arabia for 2 years and I never saw anything like this, not even close." He wanted to kick himself. If he hadn't thrown that bag of books at Daniel, if he'd exercised a little more self-control, he wouldn't have to sit there helplessly imagining O'Neill's search party being suffocated. He also knew that without Daniel, the statistical probability of them getting home was a big fat 0. They were trapped in a nightmare, and he had nailed the coffin shut. "I don't get it. Why don't we just try and turn the Stargate on ourselves? I mean, how hard could it be?" Riley suggested, a pragmatist. "Hey, there's an idea." Ferretti rolled his eyes, then explained why that wouldn't work. "If you spin that thing in the wrong order, we rematerialize somewhere out in the vast vacuum of outer space. Have you got any freaking idea how many millions upon millions of possible combinations there are on that wheel?" "No. How many?" Freeman asked Riley. Ferretti started chalking the problem up on his mental blackboard, but then caught Freeman grinning over at him. "Shut up, Freeman." The soldiers fell silent again, staring at the grand rectangle of the entrance. They could have been part of an ancient surrealist drama, an audience waiting in a giant stone chamber for the actors to make their entrances. Several miles from this peculiar stage, beyond the roaring hiss of the wind, an oblong asteroid tumbled upward over the horizon, growing in brilliance as the sky darkened to evening around it. It was the misshapen pearl that was this planet's moon, and it was suddenly blotted out by a triangular shadow moving across the sky. A few seconds later, the shadow slid away and was gone. The last light of the last sun was quickly faltering behind the impenetrable curtain of airborne sand. As it did, the light on the scene in the entrance hall dimmed until the clean edges of the radio began to decompose, dwindling into the approaching night. The soldiers heard something coming from the direction of the entrance. Rifles snapped to the ready. It was the unmistakable sound of metal clattering on metal. It was Ferretti's helmet vibrating atop the radio. The next moment, all the equipment, and then the entire floor of the pyramid began to tremble. "Earthquake! Just what we need, a goddamn earthquake!" "It's not!" Freeman shouted over the rumbling, moving to a sheltered position between the pillars lining the hall. The shaking and the noise got more and more intense. Hovering above the storm, slowly lowering itself through the storm, was a pyramid-shaped spacecraft. Bright beams of light knifed from its sides into the night sky. This floating pyramid was descending to a landing atop the larger pyramid on the ground. Long mechanical arms unfolded themselves, dropping into the sky like an eagle's talons as the triangular ship lowered itself directly onto the tip of the great stone structure below. The landing arms found their targets and locked down tight. This was the explanation that had eluded generations of researchers, the answer to the riddle of the Great Pyramid called Khufu. It had been built as a landing station for precisely this kind of craft. Once the landing was successful, parts of the giant spaceship's armored exterior began to move. Huge sections of the outer walls started to open and unfold. Like a high-tech origami construction, it began converting itself from spaceship to Pyramid Palace Penthouse. Before the long and complicated transformation was complete, a new presence was entering the pyramid. Deep inside the edifice, where the matching medallions had been set into both floor and ceiling, a rod of blue light shot between the two discs, connecting them. The beam spread sideways along both medallions, slowly shaping itself into a closed tube of light. The soldiers, jittery, guns trained in every direction, were whispering among themselves about what to do. At the same time, a presence was moving swiftly down the dark corridors, coming closer. Ferretti lit a flare and was about to toss it toward the entrance when he heard something behind him. He turned just in time to see a jackal-headed creature towering above him. It was too late to do anything but gasp.